I know why he lied to me. He lied to me because if I'd have known that he had a child on the way, I'd have never wasted my time with him in the first place. Like, none of this would have even occurred if he would have just told me the truth.
So do you think if he found out that you, if, let's say this week you guys were to go look at some apartments, and this is hypothetical, but you've never found out that his wife was pregnant, would that have changed anything? Like you just said, if I knew his wife was pregnant, I wouldn't be in this picture. So if his wife was not pregnant, and forgive me, but if he takes her out of the picture, you're never going to know that she was pregnant, right?
What do you mean takes her out of the picture? Like,
if he murdered her, she's out of the picture. You're never going to know if she was pregnant. If he can get away with murder, you're not going to. I got divorced from my wife. You say, do you understand what I'm saying here? If she's gone,
but this
don't lead.
Hypothetically,
please. Don't
hypothetically,
lead on.
If she,
Okay.
you understand where I'm going. If
Right,
you
but
didn't know,
you're leading into
Right.
questions that are nothing with your.
if you didn't know though,
Wait, Nick.
that she was there.
Did you hear what I said?
I'm following you. I just want her to answer a question that relates to. She said something that's important. That if he didn't have a child on the way, or if she didn't know that, she would have continued the relationship, right?
but he killed his kids. At what point does he think that I'm going to be in a relationship?
I'm not talking about the children. I'm just talking specifically about her. If you only knew, if the kids were still here, and he called you and said, "I'm divorced from my wife," and he gets away with this, do you understand what I'm thinking from his aspect?
I still wouldn't do it. I still wouldn't do it because I'd be like, where did she go?
Okay.
Because I'm under the impression that she's a really good mom. Like, he never bashed her momming skills. Like, no, I wouldn't, no.
Okay.
No.
And that, you see where I'm trying to take that?
Yes.
So you guys never had a conversation about the child, period?
I didn't know at all.
All right.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. About an hour and 10 into the 3-hour, 30-minute interview with Kessinger, at almost exactly the 1/3 mark, there's a decisive moment when CBI agent Kevin Kobach flights a motive for Chris Watts. At that very moment, Kessinger's father intervenes. There are a bunch of subtleties and nuances to this moment because at the same time that there are dynamics emerging between the three sitting at the table, Martinez is actually mostly silent during this period. This discussion is about dynamics. It's a vital part of the Watts story, and I still think it's misunderstood by many, if not most. Let's start by reviewing Kobach's first guess at Watts' motive before dealing with the dynamics on display by Kessinger and her father. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I do think it is helpful to look at the transcript and just to slow this whole thing down. We look at Kessinger saying, "I think I know why he lied to me. He lied to me because if I'd have known that he had a child on the way, I would have never wasted my time with him in the first place. Like none of this would have even occurred if he would have just told me the truth." And this actually triggers a thought in Kobach's mind. He's thinking, what would have, in terms of a man and in terms of Chris Watts, what would have been a signal to Chris Watts that Kessinger would have dumped him, would have left him? And so this is what Kobach says. He says, "So do you think if he found out that you," and what he wanted to say here, he interrupts himself. What he wanted to say is, "Do you think if he found out that you would have left him, that you never would have wasted your time with him, that you would have broken off the relationship with him?" But then he changes it to sort of soften it. He says, okay, if let's say this week you guys were to go look at some apartments, and this is hypothetical, but you've never found out that his wife was pregnant, would that have changed anything? And I think what he's trying to say there is, if you didn't know that is what had happened, in other words, he had somehow gotten away with everything, didn't make the media, the police weren't called, and for whatever reason, Watts was able to get away with everything, and things did continue with Kessinger, right? Then it would be a situation where she would have assumed something like they had gotten a divorce, his wife had left, his wife had taken the children, and it was right. Do you follow that? In other words, Watts would have been controlling the narrative, and Kessinger would have been none the wiser, right? So Kobach goes on to say, if I knew his wife was pregnant, I wouldn't be in this picture. So he says, if his wife was not pregnant, and he says, forgive me, but if he takes her out of the picture, you're never going to know she was pregnant. And I think it's a brilliant analogy in a sort of simple way. Bear in mind, this was very early. This was August 16, just 3 days after the events. And if you think about what we know now, that is what Chris Watts was thinking. If my wife is not pregnant, I'm not going to have a problem here. I'm not going to have as big a problem. And so it does appear that at least on 2 occasions he was trying to poison Shanann in order for her not to be pregnant, right? So Chris Watts felt that his wife being pregnant was going to be a big problem, a big threat to his situation. So he's trying to make that not happen. Another thing that he tried to do is he tried to say that the child wasn't his. Now, according to Kessinger, she was told that, I think, on Monday night. Obviously, that could have occurred at any other point earlier on. But I don't think Watts would have tried to poison his wife if Kessinger had believed all along that it was somebody else's child. There would be no reason for that. So I think it's quite an interesting hypothesis by Kobach where he says, if he murdered her, she's out of the picture, you're never going to know if she was pregnant. If you can get away with murder, you're not going to... And then he says, I got divorced from my wife. In other words, if somebody gets divorced, that person leaves and you don't see them anymore. Well, murder, it's a kind of a similar situation, isn't it? And if you don't really know that person that well, you can almost assume that they would assume as much, wouldn't you? Bear in mind with the whole Nutgate thing, even his own parents had said something like, Shanann said, you're never going to see the kids again. So they would also assume, oh, well, we'll never see the kids again. And then he would, I guess, insulate himself against his in-laws as well. But what I think is a bit strange here is why would Dwayne Kessinger, why would Kessinger's father interject at this point? Why would he say, we don't really want to talk about this area, right? I mean, it seems to me quite credible and quite logical, and it's really putting the onus on Chris Watts. Of course, it's also making it quite an important question. When did Kessinger know about the pregnancy, and did she know about the pregnancy? So let's listen to that part again.
What do you mean takes her out of the picture?
If he murdered her, she's out of the picture. You're never going to know if she was pregnant. If he can get away with murder, you're not going to... I got divorced from my wife. You say, do you understand what I'm saying here? If she's gone...
But this...
Don't lead.
Hypothetically.
Please.
Yeah.
Don't
hypothetically.
lead on.
If she...
Okay.
You understand where I'm going. If
right,
you didn't know...
You're leading into
right.
questions that are nothing with your...
If you didn't know, though...
Wait, Nick.
That she was there.
Did you hear what I said?
I'm following you. I just want her to answer a question that relates to... She said something that's important. That if he didn't have a child on the way, or if she didn't know that, she would have continued the relationship, right?
But he killed his kids. At what point does he think that I'm going to be in a relationship?
I'm not talking about the children. I'm just talking specifically about her. If you only knew, if the kids were still here, and he called you and said, "I'm divorced from my wife," and he gets away with this. Do you understand what I'm thinking from his aspect?
I still wouldn't do it. I still wouldn't do it because I'd be like, where did she go?
Okay.
Because I'm under the impression that she's a really good mom. Like, he never bashed her.
So this is definitely an area where there's some uncertainty. As it is brought up, Dwayne says to his daughter, wait, Nick. And there's a period where she looks to him for guidance, where her body language is certainly pretty close. She literally crosses both arms right over her chest, over her shoulder. She looks quite guarded, right? And one wonders what the father and daughter know beyond what is ultimately known by law enforcement, if anything. But it does seem quite defensive. I don't know whether her father is being overly protective or being reasonable, but if you think about what is actually being said, it's really putting the onus on what Chris Watts did. And if we think about what has been revealed in terms of the ping, in Frederick and all that kind of thing, one wonders whether there was a concern that there would be suspicion, either unreasonable suspicion or perhaps reasonable suspicion. But one wonders what that particular moment was all about. What was in the mind of her father, what was in the mind of Kessinger to prompt that guardedness, that high level of guardedness. It seems in a way unnecessary because it's saying what Chris Watts' motive was. At the same time, it makes us wonder, what is Kessinger really thinking here? Now, once again, if we go to the transcript and we look at what Dwayne is actually saying, he's saying, you're leading into questions that are nothing with your... So it's almost like he's worried that it's going into a different area, perhaps what Kessinger knows in terms of certain things. And that's not really what he's doing. He's actually asking questions about what's his motive. Anyway, he says... just look at the words. He says, if you didn't know, though, that she was there, right? And that's where he says, wait, Nick, did you hear what I said? Right? And anyway, she says, I'm not. I'm following you. In other words, Kobach says, I'm not leading. I'm following you. He says, I just want her to answer a question that relates to, she said something that's important, that if he didn't have a child on the way, if she didn't know, that she would have continued the relationship, right? And then that's where Kessinger interjects and says, but he killed his kids. At what point does he think I'm going to be in a relationship? It's kind of moving it away from the pregnancy narrative, but it's nevertheless quite a good point, is Kobach's kind of making the case that if he simply killed his wife, that would have made it seem like there's a divorce, right? That there's no pregnancy and there's a divorce and that Shanann is left or something. But the fact would have remained, if that was the case in that hypothetical, that the kids would have remained behind. Well, where's their mom now? And I think she does make a good point. Kessinger does make a good point. She says, at what point does he think that I'm going to be in a relationship? In other words, so his wife's disappeared, his kids have disappeared, but so we're just going to carry on in a relationship regardless. And I think that is what he thought. He mistakenly did think that. And so Kobach's just trying to make the point. He says, I'm not talking about the children. I'm just talking specifically about her, about Shanann. He's almost saying, imagine if the kids weren't part of this dynamic, right? He says, if the kids were still here and he called you and he said, I'm divorced from my wife, and he gets away with this, he says, do you understand what I'm thinking? And she says, I still wouldn't do it, meaning I still wouldn't be in the relationship. And then she says, because she'd say, where did she go? I'm not sure if that completely makes sense to me, because, would she really have thought that if there was no media presence, if there were no police, he could have just said she went back to North Carolina? Of course, in the reality of the situation, the kids do matter, and that brings us to this analysis, which I think is quite pertinent. Many folks listening in on this, if not most, I think shut down on even examining this hypothetical because they insist Kessinger had to have known about the child. That sort of seems to be what everyone is obsessed about, everyone is focusing on, about the pregnancy. What I want to do here is consider the scenario Kobach is presenting on its own terms. And I want us to move our focus, our perspective away from this obsessive focus on Kessinger and move it back to Chris Watts. So consider it not from Kessinger's perspective or your perspective looking in on this, in other words, projecting or transferring, but imagine it from Chris Watts' perspective. And that's also what Kobach's trying to do here. His perspective, and that is Kobach's perspective of Chris Watts' perspective, is he's desperately in love, he's addicted to Kessinger, and he wants to make absolutely sure his relationship with her survives. He's trying to preserve that relationship. He's trying to make sure that there's continuity to it. And the context is Shanann is arriving home for good this time after an extended period away. You know, she was away for a long period followed by a second short trip. And until Sunday night, Watts has been able to lie to both women. But now that Shanann's back, the truth is about to come out. Forget about what precisely that truth is. The bottom line is it's a situation that could very well cost him his relationship with Kessinger. So what does he do? He's asked Shanann for a divorce. He says he doesn't want the baby. We know this from the phone data review. He also said something about he's not in a hurry to get divorced. He's also told Kessinger his divorce is finalized. It's like in the final stages. Instead, the reality is Shanann has only just started cottoning on to the idea that Watts isn't happy. And how she responded, she's digging in. She's writing him love letters and sending him books to save their marriage. And they're supposed to have marriage counseling and go on a romantic trip the following weekend. She's fighting for her marriage. And Watts realizes if he doesn't do something, he's going to lose. He's going to lose probably his wife and his mistress. And so it's a situation where Shanann wants in, but Watts wants in with Kessinger. If Shanann finds out about Kessinger, that could cost him his relationship with her as well. I think it's easy for the idea that Shanann was pregnant to cloud out some of the other narratives as well. As far as Kessinger was aware and likely hoping and likely relying on, Watts and his wife were separating, and her being away for 5 weeks is going to make that seem likely, realistic, and true. But now that Shanann's back and wanting to do a gender reveal, Watts is in trouble. Why? Because now that Shanann's back, they're not getting a divorce, and he feels he just can't give Kessinger up, and he feels he just can't have this third baby either. He also feels it's up to him to take control of the situation, but he doesn't know how. He doesn't know what to say, and telling the truth doesn't seem like it's an option, because what would that look like? So I think in the same way where Kobach says, if I knew, he's kind of using almost Kessinger's narrative in a way. He's using her psychology. He's saying, if I knew his wife was pregnant, I wouldn't be in this picture. And instead of that, he could also have said, if I knew he was not getting divorced, if I knew that the divorce wasn't happening, I wouldn't be in this picture. I think one can say that as well, don't you think? Bear in mind, they were supposed to go and look at apartments, so if it's kind of a situation where, sorry, we can't do that, why? What's going on? Well, I don't know how to say this to you, but the divorce really is kind of delayed, postponed. How do you think Kessinger's going to react to that? So what if he could make it look like Shanann simply left again? It's her trip to North Carolina all over again. She came home briefly, then left with the kids. Why would Kessinger think anything about that? Watts' mistake in the criminal sense was he was preoccupied with what Shanann thought and might do, and what Kessinger might think and how she might react. So he's really just worried about two people. And because he'd fooled both women for an extended period of some weeks, he probably didn't give much thought to how hard it might be to fool anyone else. He probably felt all he needed to do was keep Kessinger, and the easiest way of getting an insta-divorce was murder. And that would need to include the kids, because how could Shanann leave and not take the kids? So the kids were killed in order for the Shanann left narrative to hold water. Seems like a terribly callous, cold, superficial reason, doesn't it? Of course, didn't he even have a relationship with his children, that he wouldn't even think, I really don't want to do this? And instead it seems like he felt, I really have to do this. Of course, the wider fabric revealed what had really happened. Firstly, Nicole Atkinson alerting the authorities because Nicole knew Shanann had arrived home for good and even had a doctor's appointment the next day. Then the media camping on his porch. Remember, Watts made up the story that the kids were only going to school the following week, when it was really that day. They were supposed to be going back to school that day, which is why he called the school that morning to kind of unenroll them. Shanann would not have skipped town on an important day like Bella's first day of school. And then finally, the pregnancy. We tend to fixate on the pregnancy, but it was really a combination of things. The divorce, taking the kids, and the pregnancy, that what's needed to explain in order for things with Kessinger to proceed as normal. And I think the finances were another reason he no longer wanted to be with Shanann, and why he wanted to cheat his way out of complicated divorce proceedings. And I wonder whether Kessinger didn't actually ring the alarm bells, because it seems like she seemed smarter than Watts. She seemed to know exactly how much he couldn't afford his lifestyle. I think she was saying the lifestyle they were living was twice as expensive as what they were earning, something like that. But she was well aware that they were living beyond their means, and maybe through talking to her, Watts appreciated the seriousness of his financial situation. So when the question was raised in court, why didn't you just get a divorce? I think he knew he had to, but he also lied himself. By that time, he'd lied himself into a corner, so that when Shanann returned and they still weren't divorced, he needed to make things happen instantly. He knew that. And murder was his solution. In effect, he did it to avoid quote-unquote complications with Kessinger and to avoid a bruising confrontation with Shanann. That is why when he says that he had a conversation with Shanann, it cleverly does away with this idea that he wasn't afraid of talking to Shanann and they had a normal relationship, and it would just be a normal conversation and she was understanding. Except I don't think it would have been like that at all, not if you look at the phone data review. He preferred the idea of murder, of silencing his wife and children, of controlling the narrative, to a noisy screaming match and losing control. But he didn't figure on the rest of the world looking in, noticing something wrong, and what he was going to say to them and to say to that aspect. This is also why him not going to trial makes sense, because he had no game. He had nothing of real substance to say for himself. What he did for Kessinger, not because she asked him to do it, but because he understood that was what she expected. That is how he'd operated all this time with Shanann. He did what he did because that was what he understood was what she expected. And so he made it happen. He made his family disappear on cue, and he didn't think it would be a big deal for him or her to act normal after it afterwards. It wouldn't be a big deal for her to act normal because she would be none the wiser. Do you think Kessinger did act normal after his family disappeared? Well, she dumped him virtually immediately. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I hope you found this analysis quite interesting. I hope it has furthered your knowledge and understanding, or at least taken your thinking in a different direction to where it's been thus far. If that has happened, then I feel I've succeeded in this particular analysis. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.